The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has deep historical, political, and cultural roots that date back centuries. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union, but after the Soviet collapse in 1991, Ukraine gained independence. Despite independence, Ukraine maintained close ties with Russia for years, relying on it economically and politically. However, the relationship began to strain as Ukraine leaned more toward integration with the European Union and NATO. In late 2013, Ukraine's pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych suspended an association agreement with the European Union, sparking massive protests known as the Euromaidan movement. These protests led to Yanukovych fleeing the country in February 2014, and a new pro-Western government was installed. Russia viewed this change as a Western-backed coup and responded by annexing Crimea in March 2014, citing the protection of ethnic Russians in its strategic interest in the Black Sea region. Following the annexation, pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, declared independence. Armed conflict broke out between Ukrainian forces and the separatists, supported covertly and later overtly by Russia. The fighting caused thousands of deaths and widespread displacement. Several attempts at ceasefires were brokered, most notably the Minsk agreements in 2014 and 2015, but they were never fully implemented and sporadic fighting continued. Over the next several years, Russia increased its hybrid warfare tactics, including cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and economic pressure on Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine continued to move toward closer ties with the West. NATO and the EU increased support for Ukraine through training, military aid, and diplomatic backing. In early 2021, Russia began a large military buildup near the Ukrainian border, raising international alarm. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine from multiple directions: north from Belarus, east from Russia, and south from Crimea. The stated goals included demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine, though these claims were widely dismissed by the international community as pretexts for aggression. The initial phase of the invasion focused on capturing Kyiv and toppling the Ukrainian government. However, Ukrainian resistance proved far stronger than anticipated. Ukrainian forces, supported by widespread civilian mobilization and Western military aid, managed to repel the Russian advance from Kyiv by April 2022. Russia then shifted its focus to the eastern Donbas region in the south, aiming to secure a land corridor to Crimea. Throughout 2022 and 2023, the conflict settled into a grinding war of attrition. Russia used its superior artillery and missile systems to bombard Ukrainian infrastructure, including energy facilities, causing blackouts and civilian suffering. Ukraine launched counteroffensives in the Kharkiv and Kherson regions, regaining significant territory. Western nations, especially the United States and European Union, provided tens of billions of dollars in military, economic, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. NATO countries supplied advanced weapon systems, including HIMARS rocket launchers, air defense systems, and eventually tanks. Russia, in turn, deepened its partnership with countries like China, Iran, and North Korea, seeking military and economic support to bypass sanctions and sustain its war effort. In September 2022, Russia announced the annexation of four Ukrainian regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, despite not fully controlling them. These moves were condemned internationally and deemed illegal. Russia also intensified missile strikes across Ukraine, targeting cities and civilian infrastructure. Ukraine continued pushing for NATO membership and security guarantees while rebuilding its military capacity. In 2023, Ukraine launched a counteroffensive in the south and east, facing heavily fortified Russian defenses. Progress was slower than expected due to extensive minefields and entrenched positions, but Ukraine continued to reclaim some territory and degrade Russian supply lines. Meanwhile, Russia conducted partial mobilizations to replenish its forces and introduce harsher laws to suppress dissent at home. Domestic opposition was curtailed, media was tightly controlled, and anti-war protests were quickly quashed. The Russian economy adapted to sanctions with the help of non-Western trade partners but faced inflation, labor shortages, and declining foreign investment. In 2024, the front lines remained largely static, though both sides engaged in ongoing skirmishes, drone warfare, and long-range missile attacks. Ukraine ramped up its domestic weapons production, and Western countries continued their support amid debates about the long-term sustainability of aid. Peace talks remained stalled, with both sides demanding incompatible terms, Ukraine insisting on full territorial restoration and Russia refusing to retreat from occupied areas. The human toll of the war has been devastating. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians have died. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced. both internally and abroad. Cities like Mariupol, Bakhmut, and Avdiivka suffered immense destruction. The war also caused global economic disruptions, especially in energy markets and food supply chains, as both countries are major exporters of grain and fertilizer. Despite the ongoing violence, Ukraine held firm in its resolve to reclaim its territory and assert its sovereignty. The Ukrainian public largely remained united behind the war effort. Russia, meanwhile, continued to frame the conflict as a defensive struggle against NATO expansion and Western encroachment. In 2025, the war continues with no definitive end in sight. Both sides are preparing for a prolonged conflict. The international community remains divided, with most Western nations backing Ukraine, while some countries in the global South call for negotiated peace. War fatigue is growing, but so is the strategic significance of the outcome, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for global norms regarding sovereignty, aggression, and the future of international order.